Hi, my name is Peter Bogert, and I'd like to welcome you back to our study in 1 Peter this week. I want to express appreciation to Dick Regal for his willingness to step in for a couple of weeks and allow me the opportunity to work on some project-related things that I needed to get done. But today we're going to be jumping back into 1 Peter, and we're going to be looking at the subject of the Christian and authority, beginning with verse 13 of chapter 2 and moving through verse 7 of chapter 3. We talked about the Christian and government the last time that I taught this class, and we'll include that passage today, but I want to look at the broader subject of the Christian and authority. So far, just to catch us up a little bit, so far we've been looking at 1 Peter, and in the early chapter and a half that we've looked at, we've seen what Christ has done for us and how God has made us a part of his family. And out of that relationship with God through Christ, we have been called, because we are now part of God's family, we've been called to live in a way that is different from those who don't know Christ. We're told to live in a way that is holy. And we can read that especially in the beginning part of chapter 2. Now, in chapter 2 also, verses 11 and 12, I kind of feel that these verses summarize the heart of what Peter is saying through the rest of the book. I don't know that, I guess I would call them key verses. I think that's an appropriate title for them, that they serve as a summary of what Peter is going to be aiming at in the rest of this letter. And he writes in chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." So again, the last time we were together, we saw how Christians are supposed to live under the authority of those who have been appointed by God to govern. In the next section, beginning with verse 18, Peter tells slaves to be subject to their masters and wives to be subject to their husbands. And while he does speak to husbands in chapter 3, verse 7, the main emphasis in this whole passage is on how Christians should live when they occupy a place of comparative weakness. I would almost use the word inferiority, but I don't want to do that because it conveys something about a person's value. And we're not talking about a person's value here. We're talking about where they fit in the pecking order within society. And so where do we fit within our culture, and what authority figures do we have over us because of that? Bear in mind that in Peter's day, the government had far more power over the citizen, the average citizen, than our government has today. Obviously, our government is very powerful, but they are not an absolute power. And at least in our Western world, there is no relationship between masters and slaves, which probably is better translated household servants. It just seems to fit that way. These people were people who worked within the households of the Roman families. They were often doctors and filled other professions, as well as caring for the kids and teaching and those kinds of things. So they were servants. They were very highly regarded in some cases, but they lived in subjection to their masters. We often apply this kind of passage when it talks about the relationship between servants and masters. We apply that to the workplace today. And there's legitimacy in that, but being a household servant was far different from working for someone else in the way that we do today. And I think it's good for us to remember, too, that women in Peter's day did not enjoy a great deal of the esteem that they do in our day. That it has been said that one of the things that Christianity did was elevate the status of women in the Roman culture. And I believe that's true. Now, despite these differences between Peter's day and our day, I do believe that we can still make a number of practical applications to our lives, and that's what I'd like to do in our session this week. Now, what Paul is going to say in this passage, beginning with chapter 2 and verse 13 and going on, as I said, through verse 7 of chapter 3, comes out of those commands in verses 11 and 12 to abstain from wrong desires and to keep our conduct among the Gentiles honorable. And I'd like to make 3 observations about what he says that give us a general idea of how we should live under authority in our day. The first thing I'd like to point out is this. The fact that we need to be told to be subject to authority shows that our natural tendency is to desire self-rule. Let me say that again. The mere fact that we need to be told to be subject to authority shows that our natural tendency is to desire self-rule. In other words, we prefer not to be subject to authority. We prefer to be our own people, making our own decisions. We don't like it when we are told what to do. Children will quickly say, "You're not the boss of me." And as adults, we refine that a little bit, but adults bristle sometimes when they're forced into a situation where there's an authority figure that has control over aspects of their lives. I think that's true of everyone because we are all prone to rebellion as sinners. But it may be more true of people in Western nations where we have more freedoms and where we can look upon others telling us what we can and cannot do as an infringement on our freedoms. People in other countries where there's a totalitarian government can certainly resent that. But when we have the ability to exercise the freedoms that we do day by day, and someone is speaking into that, it is not always something that we enjoy, is it? Regardless of your opinion on our past or present administrations, I think that we would all agree that a lot of us who accepted government mandates at the beginning of the pandemic are starting to grind a little bit and be tired of the way that government has affected our personal choices. And I'm not going to speak for or against what those mandates are. That's not the place of this study. I have my opinion. I'm sure you have yours. But the bottom line is that we live in a culture that right now is far more restrictive than it was 2 years ago. And we can see around us as people begin to react to the wearing of masks and to social distancing and to how many people are allowed in a store or in a sporting event or in a restaurant, that people are beginning to tire of those things. I wonder if in totalitarian countries, if there would be such a high level of discord. I don't know that there would be. When we find ourselves having to live under these added guidelines, they become a burden to us and we can become resentful. Why is that? Because our natural tendency is to desire self-rule. And so we need to be told that we have to be subject to authority. God has clearly established institutions of authority in order to give society a sense of order. And in our day, these authorities are not absolute in the way they were in the first century, but they are still authorities. For example, today, if we don't like the government, there's always hope that we can change the government by working toward change or by our vote. That wasn't true in Peter's day. The emperor was viewed as a god, and his authority was absolute. Today, if our boss is unfair, we have the freedom to look for another job, or in some cases where the workplace is unionized, we can appeal to our union representatives. That was not true in Peter's day. The household servant was often treated very well, but as I was reading in Philemon this morning for my own Bible reading, I came across Paul's appeal to Philemon to be caring and accepting of Onesimus, even though Onesimus had probably taken something from him. Paul says, charge that to my account. In the Roman world, it would be expected that that servant would be beaten, perhaps even to the point of death, because masters held that authority. I doubt that any of us have gone to work and come to the point where we've been beaten up by our boss because of what we did or didn't do. So again, if our boss is unfair, we can look for another job. It's different than it was in Peter's day. And then with regard to husband and wife relationships, whereas women did not enjoy a place of status in the Roman world, in most cases, Today, if husbands are abusive, there are recourses, legal recourses for women to pursue that did not exist in Peter's day. But the bottom line, as Peter talks about the need to be subject to authority, is that not submitting to authority needs to be the exception rather than the rule. We're to be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, he says, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, and he goes on and deals with governmental stuff. He says, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. And then he says in chapter 3, verse 1, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands. And so there's no squeeze room there. We do not have to obey authority when that authority puts us in a place where we have to disobey God. But there are no clear-cut guidelines for how we approach those situations. And if we were to, for example, in a situation where our government placed restrictions upon our church, we would have to decide, are we going to live with that, or are we going to bear the consequences of not living with that? And it's important that we realize that anytime we decide as Christians that we're going to not follow authority, we have to be willing at the same time to deal with the consequences that brings and to not fuss about it, because that is our choice. We've chosen at that moment to do what we feel is the right thing and bear the consequences of it. So the first thing is that the fact that we need to be told to be subject to authority shows that our natural tendency is to desire self-rule. The second point that I want to make is that our behavior influences the way others view the gospel. In terms of dealing with authority, that is a very true thing. We see it in 2:15, for example, where Peter has been speaking about the need to submit to every human institution. He says, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. And in chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, he says, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. And while there is no specific linking of the obedience of the household servant to the master, there certainly is that connection there, that if a household servant claimed to be a Christian and did not act like one, that it would not enhance the gospel message. So we need to realize that this is a very, very important thing, that our behavior influences the way others view the gospel. And Peter echoes what Paul has written in a number of other places, reminding us that one of our priorities is to bring no shame on the gospel. Sadly, we've had cases over the last several years of well-known Christians. I don't want to call them celebrities, though sometimes they have held that status among the evangelical crowd. But several important men and women who were influential within the Christian world and failed morally. And we all know what happens when that report comes out, because it usually doesn't come out just within Christian circles. When a person who's well known fails morally, and there is a controversy surrounding their lifestyle and their choices, well, that's picked up by our news media right away, and rightly so. There's nothing wrong with that. But we all kind of cringe a little bit, don't we, when we see that happen? Because it's like a black eye for the gospel. I find myself just shaking my head and thinking this is a terrible thing when someone fails in that way. That the gospel message ends up being looked upon negatively because it's tied to the people who believe it and have acted wrongly. And it may not be fair that we're all lumped together, but we are. Those named people that have failed are people who, for lack of a better word, end up representing us. If they're Christians and we're Christians, then their hypocrisy is possibly our hypocrisy, where their failure is possibly repeated by the average Christian, where their money grabbing and dishonesty is also possibly the way that most churches are. Fair? No way. But it shows the reality that guilt by association is a real thing. And if we are going to enhance the message of the gospel, we need to make sure that we live in ways that do not bring offense to the gospel. And one of the big things is that we live in an orderly way, and we live as good citizens, as good workers, and within our family structures, we live as good wives, and I'll also add husbands and children for that matter. That we follow the authority that is there. Because when we are rebellious, it only communicates something negative about the faith that we hold to. I was thinking about this yesterday. It may be that in terms of Christian witness to our own culture, that one of the most valuable tools is to do what Peter says here and what Paul said in Philippians 1:27 when he wrote, "Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ." I mean, think about it. We have numerous evangelistic tools, programs, tracts, booklets, resources, different ways that we would like to think can help us reach out into the culture around us, and in many cases they do. But when the person who's giving out that tract is someone who has a reputation of being uncooperative or rebellious, well, that doesn't help the message, does it? And it may be that as we find ourselves entering into an era where more and more hostility is directed toward the church, that one of the greatest tools that we will have in allowing us to evangelize people is a life that represents Christ well. If you are a good worker, when you speak about the gospel, those who work with you and your employers will relate that to the way you are. If you do not put in a good day's work, if you do not treat people nicely in the office, whatever, if you act in ways that are not godly ways, if I act in ways that are not godly ways, well, when we speak, our speaking has no credibility. And we need credibility in our age. The third observation I'd like to make, the first one was that we realize that we need to be told to be subject to authority because our natural tendency is to self-rule. And the second point is that our behavior influences the way others view the gospel. The third big idea here, I believe, is that if we are mistreated, Jesus leaves us with an example to follow. And that really is part of the heart of verses 18 through the end of the chapter, verse 25. Look at what Peter writes about Jesus. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Jesus displayed character that could not be condemned. No one could point a finger at wrongdoing in Jesus or hypocrisy in Jesus. No one could say, well, Jesus, you committed sin, or Jesus, there was deceit in the way that you spoke. And Jesus didn't revile, talk back to people, be unkind and critical. And when he suffered, he didn't threaten, though he certainly could have. Can you imagine the threats that Jesus could have given rightly because of the suffering that was inflicted upon him? But Jesus didn't do those things. We need to ask ourselves, what did Jesus do when he suffered? And we need to follow that example. I think that the example of Jesus is even behind what Peter writes to women in chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. He says, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Now listen to this. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is in God's sight is very precious. Now, Peter, I do not believe, is prohibiting dressing up to look nice. Rather, he is saying, don't be a person who's known for how they look on the outside. Let people know you for the beauty that exists on the inside. That doesn't mean that women are doormats, but it does mean that they show an example within their home and within their neighborhood and within their culture of being godly women by showing the characteristics that Jesus showed when he faced difficulty. Well, our world is not an easy world in which to live, is it? And it's often compounded by people who are placed in authority over us and misuse that authority. But the overarching concern that Christians have is never our rights. It's never for our rights. Rather, our concern is always that our lives back up our claim to be followers of Christ. And I think if you read through this passage and just stand back and say, what is he saying about authority and how we live with authority? Even authority that may be oppressive at times, because each one of those three places of authority could be oppressive for the people in Peter's day. That if we step back from that and look, we find out that God has given us a very definite plan on how we can deal with that authority, live with injustice, and follow Christ, and thereby be a witness to our culture. Now, I want to thank you for being here this week and encourage you if you'd like to keep going. We're going to be dealing with the passage beginning in verse 8 of chapter 3, and I'm not quite sure how far we're going to get next time, but you can read the rest of chapter 3, verses 8 through 22, and there are places where you're going to read it and you're going to say, huh? And you're going to scratch your head, and that's okay because sometimes I do that too. And we'll learn together what Peter is saying in the rest of chapter 3. Have a great week, and God bless you.